War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, No Man's Song. He always watched the audience as he played. He looked on as men who ranked higher than he did mingled around the room after their high-priced steak dinner. There were rarely any women at these military functions. These late evening dinner parties that the brass threw for themselves were strictly for those serving and not their families. His fingers pressed against the bowels of his trumpet with practiced precision, in rhythm with the other instruments in the band. The song was the Blue Danube, a popular piece that was smooth and elegant, a song that was perfect for a formal dinner like this one, a dinner for military elites. Sebastian Whitaker had become obsessed with music in his early teens. He had always wanted to play the trumpet, and when he began secondary school, he had gotten his wish. He had been in the British regimental band now for 6 years. He had only joined the military after he had learned of the band's existence. As the song reached its end, Sebastian lowered the instrument from his lips, licking them to replace the moisture they had lost during the piece. He glanced towards Glenn Foreman, the band leader, and watched him indicate that it was time for the band to take a 5-minute break. Laying the trumpet in his lap, he turned to the man behind him. His name was Kellen Richards, and he played the clarinet. Kellen had been feeling a little under the weather earlier in the day. "How you feeling, Kel?" Sebastian asked. He watched as his friend wiped his brow with a cloth he had draped over his shoulder. "I'm getting by. Still not feeling the greatest." "You getting snot all over your clarinet?" Kellen laughed at this. "Not yet, but trust me, it's a struggle." "Just try not to get any mucus on the higher-ups, will you?" Sebastian added. "I cannot promise that at all. If I sneeze, it's bound to fly everywhere and everyone will hear it." Sebastian looked around the room. "At least we have a livelier audience than the last one." Kellen looked at him with an unpleasant look. "Our last gig was a funeral." "Yeah, and this one is livelier. For obvious reasons." He looked back again at Kellen to see the response to his little joke, but Kellen was not laughing. He was not even smiling. Instead, he looked past Sebastian at the room before them all. Sebastian followed his gaze. The atmosphere in the room had changed. Instead of officers mingling slowly around the room, snacking on hors d'oeuvres and making polite conversation, there was a hectic feeling that permeated them all, and some made their way out of the small ballroom. "What's going on?" Sebastian asked nobody in particular. He watched as a man in military dress, he looked like a major, approached Glenn. Something was happening. Why would they address the band leader? The conversation was brief and not intense. Looking from the conversation and back to the room, he saw that the officers continued to make their way to the exits. He heard Cal speak behind him. "I'm taking the party as over?" "It looks like it," Sebastian began. "Mark the date, June 28th, 1914. Glenn Foreman was forced to stop a show." After the room had emptied of everyone except the wait staff and the band, Glenn stood before them and filled them in. He told them that there had been an assassination in Sarajevo. A man of great importance to Austria had been the victim. That was all he knew. As a result, their audience had realized they had more important things to attend to that evening. That had been just over a month ago. In the time since, the regimental band had not played anything of significance. No formal dinners, no ceremonies, no reason to gather beyond routine. They remained where they were. Instruments kept clean, uniforms kept ready, waiting for word that never seemed to come. The rest of the regiment had not waited. Sebastian had noticed a change almost immediately. What had once been routine had sharpened into something more deliberate. Drilling had become constant, longer hours, tighter formations, less room for error. The entire base had become aware of the news coming out of Europe, even if no one claimed to understand it fully. Austria had blamed Serbia. Germany was backing Austria. Russia was backing Serbia. Names passed between men as if they meant something more than places on a map. It felt, to Sebastian, like a game of football, countries choosing sides, lines being drawn. Only this was not an innocent game. In this one, people could die. He sat beneath a tree outside the barracks, where the shade gave him a place to watch without being in the way. The ground beneath him had been worn flat from days of movement. Boots had passed over it again and again, leaving nothing but packed dirt and shallow impressions. His trumpet rested across his lap. His fingers moved along the valves out of habit. One, then another, then back again. He was not playing, just fidgeting. 7 years in the army, and most of it had been spent with that instrument in his hands. Not a rifle, not a shovel, a trumpet. He had joined because of it, stayed because of it, built his place around it. Across the yard, men moved in lines. Boots struck the ground in rhythm. Rifles rose and fell at command. Another group worked along a growing wall of sandbags, stacking and restacking them as if the placement itself mattered. Orders carried across a yard in sharp bursts, followed without hesitation. Sebastian watched them, his fingers still moving. He did not know the commands they shouted. He had never needed to. Men marching, men running, men working with bayonets and sandbags. The regiment was in full preparation mode. The only question was, what were they preparing for? Movement near the administration building caught his eye. A man stepped out, paused only for a moment, then broke into a run faster than anyone else had moved that day. His cap sat uneven on his head, his stride unsteady as he crossed the yard. He didn't slow as he reached the others. His voice carried before he reached them. "We've declared war." Campfires dotted the site. They were 2 miles from the front lines. Things had moved rather quickly since that fateful day back in early August. It had taken only a few weeks from the declaration of war for British troops to be in armed combat with the advancing Germans. Sebastian had been here for a month now. He stood near the other band members, trumpet in hand, as the mid-September sun began its descent over the horizon behind them to the west. They had played every night since their arrival in France. It was something command thought would be good for morale. They did not play somber songs. They were all upbeat and happy, something Glenn Foreman thought was important. Sometimes he missed the notes. His eyes were fixed on the distance, where the smoke and fire rose with the sound of explosions. He had gotten used to the injured men walking past or stopping to listen to the music. Seeing their dirty faces, some injured, some not, made the outgoing music seem out of place, at least to Sebastian. When the music stopped, he retreated to the tent he shared with 4 other musicians. There was Marcel the bassoonist, Pierre, who played the bass drum, René, the clarinet player, and of course his friend Kellen, who also still played the clarinet. A new normal had permeated these men, a normal where after the music stops, they have very little to say, if anything at all. Instead, they quietly slip into their cots and try to sleep. Tonight, however, the shelling was more constant and louder than normal. almost as if it was closer. So all 5 men sat up in their cots, exchanging the occasional glances, sometimes covering their ears. They sat for hours in the silence of their tent. Only Marcel had gotten any sleep. He had slept sitting up, but only for a few minutes. When the morning had finally begun to bring light into the stillness of the dark tent, he lay there, listening to the cacophony of shelling just a few miles away. Suddenly, just as quickly as it had begun, the shelling stopped, and an eerie uneasiness crept in. He sat upright on his cot and could hear a commotion from just outside the tent. He looked around at the other men and finally spoke. "What's going on?" It was Marcel that answered. "Not sure. Should we go look?" Sebastian looked at his best friend Kellen, who said, "I'm not going out there." He watched as Pierre stood and pulled back the flap of the tent. Outside, a flurry of activity had taken hold. Men grabbed gear and spoke in rapid tones, but their words were lost in the air. Sebastian could not make out what was happening, or why. In a daze, Sebastian stood and walked out of the tent. He saw 3 men running by, one with a machine gun and the other 2 with ammunition cans. Were they a team? He finally yelled at another man as he was running by. "Hey, you! What's going on?" The man slowed, turned, and began sprinting backwards to face him. His face was dirty, except for the faint lines that ran from the corners of his eyes down his cheeks. Had he been crying? "I don't know," was all the man said before he turned back and went into a full run towards the east, towards the front lines. Renee appeared next to him. "Should we play?" Renee asked. Sebastian did not even have to think about his answer. In a hushed tone, he said, "No." They should have played. He thought it now as he glanced toward the small case that housed his trumpet. It was dusty, unmoved for the last 7 months. It was happening again, the constant shelling of their position. It had been going on for 2 straight days, and now he knew what it meant. One morning, be it today, tomorrow, or even 3 days from now, the shelling would stop abruptly, and the German ground attack would begin. He and Kellen were the only ones left in the tent now. The others had been moved to different battalions when High Command decided they were better utilized as stretcher bearers than musicians. Morale was no longer a concern. Kellen, who had long ago become Sebastian's best friend, suffered from night tremors, so they had pushed 2 of the now unused cots together and occasionally slept there, side by side. This, so far, had been the only thing to bring Kellen any comfort, and Sebastian did not mind. Unlike the first time, he was able to get some sleep these days when the shelling was constant, even though he knew what was coming. Tonight, however, he stared at the ceiling of the tent as Kellen snored quietly beside him. He thought of the things he had seen since his reassignment as a stretcher-bearer. The mangled legs and arms, the protruding guts, the disfigured, bloody faces. He thought of the decisions he had had to make, whether to lift a man out of the mud because he could be saved, or to leave him there because the attempt would be in vain. He wondered how Marcel, Renee, and Pierre were doing, where they had ended up, if they had managed to stay together like he and Kellen had. Then he lay there, staring into the dark, wondering how the next day would unfold. He knew the pattern now. He had seen it enough times to recognize it for what it was. The shelling would stop just before dawn. If not tomorrow, then the next day. It always came to an end the same way. And when it did, it would not be a relief. It would mean the Germans had decided they had done enough, that they were ready to come forward and throw the full weight of their attack against the line. So far, they had managed to repel the German attacks and hold their position. They had launched barrages of their own, even pushed forward when ordered. But he knew it could not go on like this forever. This back and forth, this endless trading of ground measured in yards. Someday, somehow, it would come to a head. The line would break. One side would give way. The only question was which one. The silence woke him. He sat up in his cot and saw Cullen, already dressed, standing near the entrance of the tent. He was watching the familiar movements outside, men readying themselves, men prepping to move forward and holding the line. "Is it time?" Sebastian asked. Cullen turned to him. "Yeah, hope you got some sleep." "Barely any," Sebastian returned. He swung his legs over the side of the cot and stood, beginning to ready himself for what was ahead. Another day of it. The carnage, the scream, the kind of fear he would not wish on his worst enemy. Cullen grabbed the stretcher, which they kept propped against the wall in the tent, and they made their way towards the line of men lined up at the sloping entrance to the trench system. They would follow this cutout in the earth for almost 2 miles until they dumped into the main forward trench, which is where the chaos would start. By now, Sebastian knew what this moment meant. Those in the front trench would be preparing to go over the top, preparing to meet the Germans in the barren stretch between the lines they all called No Man's Land. Eventually, every man in this line, including Sebastian and Cullen, would go over as well. Their job sounded simple enough. Take the stretcher, go forward, find the wounded and bring them back to the trench where they could be passed along to the medical post behind the line. But it meant going where the others fell, across the same ground, through the same fire. There was nothing about them that made them safe. No sign the enemy was required to honor. Just 2 men and the stretcher between them. They heard the cry before they saw the man. Both of them turned, scanning in every direction. There were voices everywhere, men calling out, some weak, some frantic. But this one was different. Closer. Close enough. They paused, listening, trying to place it. "There!" Cullen shouted, pointing towards a deep shell hole. Sebastian didn't hesitate. He followed Cullen and jumped down after him. His boots sank the moment he landed. The bottom of the crater was filled with stagnant water and bodies. Sebastian looked down, trying to count them. He stopped at 6. They moved to the wounded man. Cullen was already at work administering morphine. Sebastian took him in at a glance. The left leg was gone at the knee. He moved without thinking. Pulling his belt free from his trousers, he wrapped it tight above the wound and clinched it down, using it as a tourniquet to slow the bleeding. When they were done, they lifted the man onto the stretcher. Then they began the slow climb out of the crater. Once out, the real danger returned. Shells still fell, sending dirt and metal through the air, carving new holes into the earth. Bullets snapped past without warning. And men running in every direction, some brave, some breaking, all of them afraid. Sebastian led, gripping the front handles with his arms locked at his side. Cullen followed behind at the other end. They ran. Sebastian felt the weight shift. Cullen's end dropped. The stretcher dipped and dragged him backward. He stopped and shouted without turning. "Come on, Cullen, pick it up. Not much farther." The weight lifted again, settled. "Attaboy, Cullen," he called. They ran harder. The trench came into view. Sebastian reached it first. He lowered his end, dropped into the cutout, and grabbed the frame of the stretcher, pulling it towards him and turning it sideways to bring it down. As the edge of the stretcher tipped into the trench, he saw the other end follow. A man dropped in behind it and took hold, matching Sebastian's movement as they lowered the wounded soldier to the floor. Only then did Sebastian stop. He sank back against the dirt wall, breath gone, arms trembling. He turned to his friend, but it wasn't Kellen. "Who are you?" Sebastian asked. "Where's Kellen?" The man didn't answer. He just raised his arm and pointed back towards no man's land. Alone in the tent, he listened to the shelling for a second straight night. Since Kellen's death, he had been reassigned to assist the quartermaster. He no longer went forward, no longer stepped into no man's land. He had no longer had to see what the bullets and shells did to the human body. Instead, he inventoried supplies, counted crates, handed out socks, weapons, and rations to the steady stream of men assigned to the position. But the shelling, followed by the silence, always brought him back to that day 6 months ago, the moment Kellen took a bullet to the head while trying to help a wounded man. He was thankful to the man that helped carry the stretcher that day, even though Sebastian never got the man's name. He recalled the moment the man pointed towards no man's land and Sebastian's instant impulse to look over the parapet and see for himself. Others nearby tried to stop him, but that was a futile task. He was going to look, even if it meant his own death. He had looked over the edge and saw bodies scattered everywhere. Which one was Kellen? He had never found out. This early morning, he sat on his cot. "I bet this is the morning," he said to himself. He stood, crossed to the other side of the tent, and picked up the dusty case that held his trumpet. He had not played in over a year. Now he removed the trumpet from its case and left the tent. The dugout was cramped with men, shoulder to shoulder, all waiting for the barrage to end. The air was thick. Dirt fell in small trickles from the timber above with each distant impact. The ground trembled, then steadied, then trembled again. Sebastian stood among them, pressed in with the rest. He had made his way back to the front line, a place he had not seen since that morning. No one spoke. They listened. They waited. Then all at once, the shelling stopped. The silence settled over them, heavy and unnatural. Sebastian heard the shift before he saw it. Men adjusting their grips, rifles being brought up, quiet breaths taken in. The moment had come. He pushed forward, forcing his way through the crowded dugout, ignoring the looks, the muttered words. He needed to be first. At the front, he stepped into the open trench. Then Sebastian walked out. He felt nothing, no fear, no anxiety, nothing at all. He found a ladder and placed his hands on the worn wood, climbed, slow, steady. He rose above the trench line and stepped out into the open. No man's land stretched before him, still and silent. He took 10 paces forward, stopped, lifted the trumpet to his lips, and began to play. In the distance, through the haze and drifting smoke, he could see them. German soldiers moving towards him. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand? Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.